Hello, and welcome to Democracy Watch on CITR 101.9 FM. This is the News Collective's weekly hour-long news report bringing you alternative and undercovered current affairs from Vancouver and the Lower Mainland. I'm Alex DeBoer.
I'm Christina Song.
And I'm Olamide Olaniyan.
It's Thursday, January 11th at 5:07 p.m. We're broadcasting from UBC's Vancouver campus on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. Today's Democracy Watch is a special extended edition. First, we present three different perspectives on intensifying resistance to the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline. You will hear from direct action activist David Mivazir, founding member of the Justin Trudeau Brigade, a group causing construction delays to the Burnaby Westridge terminal. We will then hear an environmental perspective from 350 Vancouver activist Andrew Larigakis, followed by insights on the legal battle against Kinder Morgan with West Coast environmental lawyer Eugene Kung.
After that, we'll have original reporting on Vancouver's rally in support of mass Iranian protests. But first, headlines from Vancouver and the Lower Mainland. Breaking news, Matthew Aaron Schufelt charged with sexual assault. The 28-year-old was charged with sexually assaulting a UBC student on campus 2 years ago, and he pled guilty today in court. He has been sentenced to 21 months in jail and will be eligible for parole in 14. The victim, who remains unnamed because of a publication ban, continues to suffer the effects of sexual trauma, according to the justice overseeing the case. Related to this, UBC has opened an online survey to collect feedback on the university's sexual assault policies. The survey comes after the Liberals passed a law requiring post-secondary schools to create clear procedures on how sexual assault complaints are reported and responded to. You can find and fill out the survey at engage.goc.bc.ca until January 29th.
Mayor Gregor Robertson will not seek re-election. Mayor Gregor Robertson, who's been mayor since 2008, almost a decade, will not be seeking re-election in 2018. Robertson released a statement yesterday calling it one of the hardest decisions of his life. He later tweeted that there was still lots to do with the rest of his term. This includes building the Broadway subway, improving transit in Metro Vancouver, and tackling affordable housing. It's also worth noting that Robertson never achieved his pledge to end homelessness by 2015.
High school graduation amongst Indigenous students on the rise. The British Columbia Education Ministry released statistics showing high school graduation is on the rise amongst Aboriginal students. Right now, 65.9% of Aboriginal students complete high school, an increase of 19% from the previous decade. However, these numbers are still well below the provincial average of 84%.
News from Maple Ridge. Maple Ridge receives temporary modular housing for the homeless. The provincial government has committed $3.6 million to build temporary modular housing in Maple Ridge. The proposed site is at the corner of 223rd Street and St. Anne's Avenue, also known as Anita's Place. I don't know if you guys know about that, but yeah. This area was previously a campsite for the homeless before it was shut down by the government.
BC Green Party proposes banning foreign home ownership. In December, Stats Canada reported that 5% of residential properties and 10% of condos are owned by those living outside the country. The BC Green Party wants to ban all foreign real estate sales, but some experts disagree. They say this is an imprecise and insufficient way to combat rising housing costs in Vancouver. They say that the bigger problem is that 1 in 5 Vancouverites owns 2 or more homes in the mainland. As it stands, non-citizens and those without permanent residency pay an additional 15% on their property tax.
Teacher who put student in a headlock is suspended. Vancouver teacher Weldon Chung has been suspended and asked to complete a professional boundaries workshop after physically assaulting a 15-year-old student. His suspension began on January 8th.
Whoa, that's interesting. Taxi Association negotiates with city over Uber. The Vancouver Taxi Association is trying to develop an app to provide a local transit alternative, which would be part rideshare, part taxi service. That's very interesting. The provincial government is currently holding rideshare public hearings to develop a regulatory framework to allow companies like Lyft and Uber to operate in BC. In the meantime, illegal ride-sharing is on the rise in BC. And those were your weekly headlines from Vancouver and the Lower Mainland. CITR's Democracy Now!, Democracy Watch, is going to take a short break. Please stay tuned and don't go away.
You're just playing a game. It's more than that. It's about adventure and saving the world and having magic. UBC Theatre and Film presents a high-octane dramatic comedy laden with homicidal fairies, evil succubi, and 90s pop culture. Acclaimed playwright Keek Wynn offers a life-changing journey for the geek within us all. Join Agnes the Ass-Headed on her quest to find and free the lost soul of her deceased sister in She Kills Monsters from January 18th to February 3rd at 7:30 p.m. in the Telus Studio Theatre at the Chan Center for the Performing Arts. It's a Dungeons & Dragons tale exploring sexual identity, grief, and some hella fierce woman warriors who about to open up a can of whoop-ass on ya.
I'm Alam Diolanian from Democracy.
Ready.
Cool. We're back with
We're
Democracy
back.
Watch on CITR 101.9 FM.
Quick point of correction. This is Democracy Watch, not Democracy Now! I don't think I'm Amy Goodman. I didn't steal the show's idea from Democracy Now! So we're back with Democracy Watch on CITR 101.9 FM. I'm Alex DeBoer. And we're going to go now to a news story. I'll let Olamide take over.
Cool. Thank you, Alex. I'm Alam Diolanian. You just heard headlines, and we are now tuning into some original reporting. So in the past few months, there's been ramped up opposition to the $7.4 billion Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project from the infamous pipeline company Kinder Morgan. Yesterday, Wednesday, January 10th, 2 women were arrested at the Camp Cloud trailer outside of Shellmont Kinder Morgan facility in Burnaby. They are facing charges of obstruction, and Democracy Watch reached out to Kinder Morgan for comment about delays being caused by direct actions, and they did not respond. Other groups are also getting into the fray. 350 Vancouver, which is a chapter of 350.org, and Burnaby residents opposing Kinder Morgan's expansion, Broke, and Climate Convergence Metro Vancouver are organizing a rally and banner drop for January 13th. They plan to rally and march from TD Bank at Sperling Street and Hastings Street to the Kinder Morgan nearby Westridge Marine Terminal. One group in particular, which we got a chance to talk to, has been engaging in what they call direct action, peacefully blocking the entrance to the Westridge Marine Terminal in Burnaby. They call themselves the Justin Trudeau Brigade. We have an interview with David Miveser, an organizer with the group, and he talks to us about the group and how they plan to, face Kinder Morgan in the future. Let's take a listen. I'm Alam Diolanian from Democracy Watch at CITR 101.9 FM, and I'm here with
Alex DeBoer?
We're here with David Miveser, an organizer from the Justin Trudeau Brigade. They're a group of activists that have been blocking the access to the Westridge Marine Terminal in Burnaby, part of Kinder Morgan's Burnaby Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. Their action aims to make the project financially unviable and ultimately lead to its cancellation. Hello, David.
Yes, hi there. Thanks for having me.
Cool. First off, can you tell me what the Justin Trudeau Brigade JTB is and how it came to exist?
Well, we actually just started in the very end of November. It's only been going for maybe 6 or 7 weeks. But what it is small group of thoughtful, concerned citizens who know that we have to stop the Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion. I could talk about why we think that, but probably most people already know. And honestly, we've seen protests for years. There have been huge protests, thousands and thousands of people. We've seen political work in other ways. We've seen lots of media coverage. And it seems like it hasn't really been effective because the federal government, under Justin Trudeau, approved it. So I would say that the protest has not been as effective as it needs to be, and we need to do something different from protest. So what we're doing is not protesting. We're directly intervening. It's direct physical stopping the construction work that's already begun at that site in Burnaby.
Awesome.
And we just get in the way. And when we are there, the trucks can't come in, the workers, the contractors, it can't progress. And we're not doing it in a way to attract a lot of attention. We're not interested in getting arrested. That would just be a big waste of time. So we go for 2 or 3 hours at a time. The police come and tell us to leave after a while, and then we leave. Well, while we're there, we've been effective, and then we come back again another time.
Interesting. We're going to talk more about that distinction between protest and direct action, but we wanted to ask you about your group's name, which is inspired by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's statement in March of 2016, which he made in response to Quebec's injunction to the now scrapped Energy East pipeline, where he said, governments grant permits, only communities grant permission. So we're just wondering why you chose to use that quote as inspiration for the name of your activist group.
Well, it's very clear that communities here don't grant permission to Kinder Morgan to build here. All along the pipeline, communities are trying to block it. And so far, the one thing that's permitted it has been Justin Trudeau's government. So we want to, maybe communicate to him, but certainly communicate to everybody here that it's up to us to either grant permission or deny it, and we deny it.
Right.
So it's just kind of using, honestly, it's just kind of hopefully a kind of clever, somewhat humorous thing.
It
that
is
attracts
clever.
Attention. It's like, hey, everybody, look at this. Justin Trudeau said that. So we say we're inspired by what he said, and he's really our spiritual leader in what we're doing.
Yeah. Well, and just to clarify for listeners who might not know, so this pipeline expansion is being blocked by various indigenous groups. It's being blocked by the city of Burnaby. Is it also opposed by the province of British Columbia?
It is, actually. The province of British Columbia now, with our new NDP Green government, opposes it.
Right. So it's just the federal government.
Larger organizations like governments and even large environmental NGOs, they have legal strictures that they have to abide by, right? They just have to follow the law. Mm-hmm. And actually, a small group of individual people like us, we're a total of maybe 15 or 20 people. We don't have to. We can do what we think is right, regardless of what the law says, and we're willing to do that, and so far there haven't been any legal consequences. I don't expect there will be. We've actually consulted with a lawyer, and if we just keep doing what we're doing, and more and more and more people join us, we've been doing this once or twice a week, I would just say to your listeners, if besides our dozen people, if another few dozen people would join us, we could do this many times a week. We could do it 5 or 10 times a week.
Yeah,
when the police come and tell us to leave, we just politely say, okay, we will, and then we do. Right. But then someone else should be coming right after we leave and just block the whole thing and shut it down.
Totally, yeah. We were going to ask you about that as well, your plans to expand, so we'll talk about that as well. But we just wanted to return to the Energy East situation briefly, and I just wanted to ask, how is what happened with Energy East in Quebec, besides that quote that you're using as inspiration for the group's name, how is that relevant? How can the lessons there be applied to the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain pipeline construction in Burnaby?
Right, so it was opposition from grassroots people on the ground that caused enough delays so that eventually the whole thing became unviable.
Right.
And the same thing happened right here in BC with the Northern Gateway pipeline, right? People and organizations and First Nations acted to delay it and oppose it, and eventually that caught up with it and stopped it.
Yeah.
And the same thing just a few weeks ago, there was a gas pipeline that was going to go through the Mackenzie Valley out to the Arctic Sea, and that also was abandoned after they invested billions of dollars. So,
Although
this works.
We were reading a bit that certain publications were attributing economic factors a lot to the demise of the Energy East pipeline, such as like the price of exporting Canadian oil wouldn't be worth the return. So do you think that's also a large factor in the demise of some of these pipelines? Yeah.
Oh, of course.
But in combination with the actions.
Well, causing delays enables that kind of dynamic to catch up with it.
Right.
Right? And right now, actually, Kinder Morgan, the company, Kinder Morgan, needs more investment to be able to complete this pipeline. They need something like $2 billion more, and they're not getting it. So if we can just keep, metaphorically throwing up roadblocks, although that is exactly what we are doing, potential investors will see that this is not a good use of their clients' funds to invest in here. They're not going to get the returns on it that the clients need. Just basic, fiduciary responsibility to not invest your client's money in a place where they're not going to pay off.
Cool. Thank you. Could you talk to us more about the distinction, as you mentioned before, between protest and direct action? Just speak more about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a really critical difference. We should all keep that in mind. So protest is very demonstrative, right? It's expressive. It gets attention. It puts the issue on people's agenda. You can get in the media with it, right? Politicians can start talking about it. But protest alone doesn't necessarily accomplish the goal. There's a book written 2 or 3 years ago by one of the two guys that started the Occupy movement, and it was called The End of Protest, basically about the limitations of protest. So direct action is actually directly doing what needs to be done. And it doesn't, what we're doing, like I said, there's a very small group of people. Achieving the goal is not dependent on politicians making a decision or on media deciding to report on it. It actually has direct impact. And I think that should be part of the mix. People who want to do something about the Kinder Morgan pipeline should at least consider doing this as well. There's going to be more protests. There are big protests planned roughly in a month from now. There could be hundreds or thousands of people protesting. The organizations organizing it say things like, oh, they're going to get the politicians' attention. Well, that's good, but just direct intervention can have another kind of impact, and it certainly should be part of the mix of what we're doing.
Cool. Have the Justin Trudeau Brigade been influenced by, as you mentioned earlier, that the organization is kind of fairly new, but there's also a long history of direct action and kind of opposition to at least British Columbia pipeline expansions and project. But has the organization been influenced by First Nations direct action against pipeline companies, and how do you kind of coordinate with these other groups?
Well, I would say that, for example, the Tiny House project that's kind of up the pipeline, do you know what I'm talking about?
No, could you explain what that is?
No? Okay, so there are First Nations people who are building tiny little houses, 10-foot square houses or 12-foot square houses right on the land that the pipeline has plans to build through. So the pipeline company is going to have to deal with these little houses. Right? I'm just giving an example of something also taking place right now. But we're not really coordinating. This isn't very sophisticated, and it doesn't take a lot of coordination. It really doesn't.
Yeah. It's funny, we just watched a news video on the Financial Post that was explaining how activist groups are delaying pipeline building across Canada, and they were explaining how it was really sophisticated resistance. And we were thinking it's mostly just grassroots people, you know, just resisting in whatever way they can. Like,
It
yeah.
is.
So that myth of a sophisticated resistance is a bit interesting. Yeah.
Something I think we can learn from, I understand from the Clayoquot actions, which again, there wasn't protest. It was directly going and blocking trucks. Mm-hmm. There were thousands of people involved, but at any one time, the number of people who were blocking a truck, it could have been 4 people or 6 people, you know? And by the time the police came and took those people away, there were more people that came, and then more people came. So if you were asking, have we learned from other experiences, I would say that's a good one to learn from, right? We don't need thousands of people here. If we had 100 or 200 people, we could completely shut down the construction that's going on right now at that West Ridge Marine Terminal. But we'd have to do it in shifts, right?
Yeah.
Little teams, just little teams kind of persistently coordinating with each other.
Right. Yeah, and then in terms of in your press releases that you've sent out to media organizations such as the News Collective here at CITR, it's mentioned that there was a 44-page affidavit where Kinder Morgan, VP of Operations, mentions that delays to the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline are costing somewhere between $30 and $35 million. I'm wondering if you have a way of assessing the specific financial impact that the Justin Trudeau Brigade itself is having on Kinder Morgan.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, they also said that they're losing $90 million a month in lost revenue.
Right.
Which means the pipeline's not running, the oil companies aren't paying them to ship their oil, right? $90 million a month. So just based on $90 million a month, let's just say there's 30 days in a month, so that'd be $3 million a day. And okay, $3 million a day. You could, I think let me say this a different way. We've done this 8 times now since the end of November. Each time it's 2 or 3 hours. We actually stopped the work. The trucks can't get in. The workers can't get in. So multiply 8 by 2 or 3 hours, I would say we've cost them at least 2 days worth of work.
Right.
So $3 million a day.
And
I don't know.
You don't think like that perhaps Kinder Morgan is reabsorbing the delays in other ways, such as if you delay the start of the workday by 3 hours, they force workers to work 3 hours longer or something? Like,
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think if we could expand the number of teams doing this, it would just have more impact. So I'm not too worried about measuring the exact details like that.
Yeah, fair enough.
If more of us do
it's
it,
hard to assess.
it'll have more impact, and it does have an impact. And actually, for sure, Kinder Morgan doesn't want to talk about that. They are being very careful to avoid making this into a story.
Right, you mentioned
very,
that.
Very, very delicate about calling the police, and they don't want to arrest us, just as we don't want to get arrested. So I think they don't want the public to see this as a big deal.
So you're hoping there'll be more media coverage of this?
Media coverage is good. Actually, what I'm most hoping for is that more people will come and join us.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Are there any other things that would, I guess, make your your product more successful? Your direct action?
Again, I would just say more people.
Just more people? Okay, cool.
Our team has been able to do it once or twice a week, and people are coming one by one, mostly through social media connections, right? Facebook.
Right.
Actually, people listening right now could go to Facebook, go to a Facebook site called Stop Kinder Morgan Call to Action, and scroll through there. You'll see us there. There's another one, Stop Kinder Morgan on Burnaby Mountain. We post stuff there. But people are seeing it. People are coming. We started with me, and I just called up one other person, said, how would you like to do this? And they're like, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And then the first time we did it, there was 6 of us. Now there's maybe 20.
Yeah.
And you don't need 20 people. You don't need 20 people at one time. You need 6 or 8 people at one time, and then just go again another time.
Right, shifts. Yeah. So you mentioned that Kinder Morgan has adapted to these delays you're causing. And so can you just talk a bit more about how they've adapted?
Well, they are non-confrontational, right? They actually have let us stay there. After we've been there for an hour or two, they call the police. And then the police come, and they're very gentle and very kind. So it's very Canadian, and
Yeah.
they're not, not racing at us with police dogs and billy clubs. And they tell us if we stay longer, they will just have to arrest us. And,
Yeah.
we don't want that, do we? And we're like, no, actually, we don't. So then we'll just say, can we stay another 15 minutes? And they're like, oh yeah, okay, you can do that, but then be sure to go. So no, it's very non-confrontational. And again, if we are trying to escalate. And when we do, they probably will have to escalate back. But it's a little bit of a dance, and we'll just keep doing it.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. So you mentioned earlier that there's basically opposition from almost everybody to the project except kind of like the federal level. I was wondering, how do we kind of reconcile these power divisions on land rights between provincial, federal, municipal, and then considering the fact that we're on unceded indigenous land? Yeah, I don't know. How do we reconcile that?
I've gotten clear that this is a very colonialist project. It's a company based in Houston, Texas, just forcing itself upon us, just pushing itself on us here, right? So when you talk about unceded native land, that is very clear. Unceded means stolen, just taken. Nobody gave it up. It was just taken. So I think just asserting that is helpful. And then beyond that, actually, I think your question is more like for a lawyer. I don't know the answers to that.
Well, no worries. Yeah, it's a pretty tough question to answer.
A very big question.
Legally, there are different jurisdictions, right?
Yeah,
There's federal,
absolutely.
provincial, municipal.
Yeah.
Recently, you probably know that the city of Burnaby has been very rigorously, strictly enforcing its permit regimen to protect its citizens. And Kinder Morgan found that so frustrating that they went to the National Energy Board and had the National Energy Board rule that that the city doesn't have jurisdiction to do that, which it does.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's the kind of question you asked. I think it's a good question, but I feel like there's a lot of kind of games playing. The federal government postures one way and then does something different. So.
Yeah, totally. And I wonder how much, and I'm just thinking this off the top of my head, but I wonder how much the Justin Trudeau is under more pressure to push this through as a result of the demise of Energy East, right? Because he received a lot of criticism there. But yeah, so those are all the questions we had related to the Justin Trudeau Brigade. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we kind of call this interview to a close?
Oh, well, just one thing is you're comparing this to Energy East and the pressure on Justin Trudeau, we could say, to get Canadian oil to market, by sea elsewhere. So this is really classic think globally, act locally, right? We know the whole world needs to keep it in the ground and burn less fossil fuels, right? That's global.
Yeah.
What can we do about that? We're right here, right now. So we're driven not only by understanding the dangers, to our own Burrard Inlet and to the orcas and to the fish and everybody living here, but also it's part of the whole global scene of global climate change and, pushing investment out of these very dangerous kinds of fuel into more sustainable energy. So there's a really big picture, and then there's also the local thing of what are we doing right here, right now.
Right, totally. That's a good note to end on. Well, thank you for talking with us, David.
Thank you.
Bye. Hello, and we're back. That was an interview you just heard with David Miveser, an organizer with the Justin Trudeau Brigade, a group of concerned citizens conducting direct actions to disrupt construction of the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Burnaby pipeline. So to build on this topic of resistance to the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain pipeline, we are now going to turn to another interview, which takes a more environmental approach to this to pipeline resistance. We spoke with Andrew Larry Gawkis from 350 Vancouver, the Vancouver chapter of 350.org, about actions they are taking to resist Kinder Morgan and an upcoming rally that is happening on January 13th, where they'll be stopping pipeline expansion by dropping a banner and marching to the Burnaby pipeline construction site. So stay tuned for this interview. Here we go.
Could you kind of tell us what 350 Vancouver is, and we'll just start with that.
Yeah, 350 Vancouver is a climate action group. We're connected to the larger network of 350.org, which is a global climate action group started by Bill McKibben in 2007, and it exists now in 180 countries around the world. Many thousands of people are involved. 350 Vancouver is the local chapter, and the name 350 comes from 350 parts per million, which is what's been determined as a safe level of CO2 in the atmosphere. We've far surpassed that, but that was at the time of its founding. The goal was to keep CO2 to that level, and to keep that would keep global temperatures in check. So what we do at 350 Vancouver is we're associated but independent of the larger organization, and we organize campaigns and actions related to climate issues locally. So we support campaigns, for instance, against the Kinder Morgan pipeline, against fracking, some of the coal exports, and other major fossil fuel projects in the region. And we do a number of direct action type of activities to draw attention to what we see as the worst polluters and the worst problems contributing to climate change.
Cool, thank you. Speaking of Kinder Morgan, I know 350 Vancouver has been one of the most vocal opposition to the Trans Mountain pipeline that Kinder Morgan is currently constructing, right? Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you kind of explain why, at least to 350 Vancouver, why Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain pipeline isn't such an obstacle to fighting climate change.
Well, the Kinder Morgan pipeline is going to triple capacity along the route from the tar sand, so it's going to bring 893,000 barrels of oil, diluted bitumen, through our port every day. So it's the equivalent of, depending on whose numbers you use, 20 or 35 million cars added to the road. So it's an enormous amount of CO2 that's both upstream and downstream that is associated with this project. So it is a major contributor to, along with other tar sands related projects, to Canada's CO2 emissions. It's been determined that there's no way that we can reach our very modest Paris commitments if we proceed with projects like the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain pipeline.
Thank you very much.
So we spoke with David Miveser of the Justin Trudeau Brigade yesterday, and he spoke a lot about the distinction between direct action and protest. So you just said that 350 Vancouver engages in direct action. I was wondering if you could tell me a bit more about why you're choosing direct action versus protest.
Well, we do both, but direct action is something beyond protest, where we try to get in the way
of projects and to really bring attention to the issues associated with them through less kind of indirect ways, I guess. You might say, people are educating through Facebook and through op-eds and through political engagement that they're trying to make changes. With direct action, we were able to get greater attention to issues that might normally be ignored. So, for instance, we were doing an action at the TD Bank just a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, drawing attention to their involvement as the major financier of the Kinder Morgan pipeline. And we went into the bank and were able to bring some attention through the media to their role in this project. And in doing so, we put pressure on them to live up to their commitments that they've made through their corporate social responsibility to support communities and to be environmental stewards. We've also, there's a very big, huge issue around the tank farm, the Kinder Morgan Oil Storage Depot, which is just below Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, which is going to be vastly increased in size. A massive project that's the fire department in Burnaby has said is absolutely, crazy. It's putting people's lives at risk. It's completely the wrong location. It's a very unacceptable risk to the community. And it's an issue that's been almost entirely ignored by media, by government. And, it's a huge, huge issue for the people of Burnaby, city of Burnaby, the mayor, but it's been ignored. And so, we did something which was a little action. It was a die-in. It was a fairly dramatic, somewhat theatrical event outside of the Public Safety Office, which is situated, the Federal Office of Public Safety, just outside of, just not far from the tank farm in Burnaby, and where we presented a letter to the Minister of Public Safety, Ralph Goodale. And we were able to get a lot of media attention and to raise the profile of this issue that has otherwise been ignored. You could go on writing letters to your MPs endlessly, and you can, petition them and do what you like, but you just get ignored. That's what's been happening. The issue has been completely ignored.
So, is the event that's happening on January 13th at the TD Bank downtown, is that similar to this action you're describing, or how is it different? Can you tell us what's going on for that event?
Yeah, it's similar but different. Firstly, it's being primarily organized by BROKE, Burnaby residents opposing Kinder Morgan expansion. It's creating a direct connection, physical connection between the Westridge terminal expansion in Burnaby and the TD Bank, which has a branch not far from there on Hastings near Sperling, I believe. So people will be starting at the bank and then marching to the terminal, which is not very far away, and there'll be a banner drop and who knows what else. So it's a little bit more of a protest, I would say, but again, we don't exactly know what will happen, but it's similar. Again, it hopefully will bring some attention to the issue, to the financing, to the whole question of the divestment, and yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. So what are strategies that 350 Vancouver is kind of taking to make the movement more effective moving forward?
Well, I think at this point in time, it's really important to work together with our allies to bring people together. We're fighting again with Kinder Morgan. We're fighting such a huge machine. The fossil fuel industry, working with the government and their captured regulators like the NEB, that we need to get together with groups. We're looking at Indigenous leadership. We're looking at social justice issues, and using our physical presence in addition to social media and other kinds of communication, but being physically present to engage in actions to stop this project.
Cool. Do you have anything else to add? Any kind of insights, observations, things to highlight?
Well, I just urge your listeners to get involved. Join a group. Join 350 Vancouver if you are inclined. We're very friendly and personable group of people. We have fun, and we're fighting a good cause. There's other groups around as well, and find a good fit. But get involved and do your bit because we're in a climate crisis, and people need to step up and get outside of their comfort zones.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time,
Thank you so
Andrew.
much.
We appreciate it.
Have a nice day.
Have a nice day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
And that was an interview with Andrew Larry Gawkis. I did that last time. From 350 Vancouver, the Vancouver chapter of 350.org. You're listening to CITR 101.9 FM. This is Democracy Watch, the News Collective's weekly, hour-long local news program. The interview we just heard was conducted by Olamide Olaniyan and also edited by Olamide. We will now hear an original interview that Democracy Watch conducted with Eugene Kung, a lawyer from West Coast Environmental Law. He provides the collective with insights on the legal battle against Kinder Morgan. Here we go.
So how about we just start out with you telling us a little bit more about your role and West Coast Environmental Law's role in the legal fight against Kinder Morgan.
Sure. So I'm a staff lawyer with West Coast Environmental Law. We've been around for over 40 years, working on public interest and environmental law issues. My main file is stopping the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain expansion project, and there's many ways that I spend my time doing that. A lot of that has been working with the Tsleil-Waututh Nation Sacred Trust Initiative, which is that nation's initiative to stop the project. Of course, there are many legal avenues or angles to the pipeline, including 17 current legal challenges to the various approvals, and as well as a broad kind of residents of British Columbia who are opposed for reasons ranging from the climate impacts to some more localized impacts of spills and so on.
Mm-hmm. And you were involved in the Federal Court of Appeal case back in October, right?
Yeah, so I was involved in the sense that I was following it closely, and that our clients had a lawsuit. I just want to make it clear that I was not, the lawyer in court making arguments. I was a lawyer who was in the courtroom paying very close attention, but I just don't want to take credit away from the dozens of lawyers who worked very hard to represent their clients in the case.
For sure. And the decision from that case hasn't been released yet, correct?
That's right. So the court, as they often do, reserved judgment, and so they will be writing their decision without really a concrete deadline or timeline. So we don't really know with any certainty when the decision will come. Best guess, the most kind of the closest similar case that I'm aware of was the Gatineau case, or the case that that overturned the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline decisions that similarly had a large number of applicants, First Nations, unions, and environmental groups. And that case was heard in around the same time in the fall, and their decision came out in June. So we're expecting something kind of in the next 6 months.
Okay. And then do you think do you think it's going to follow the same way as the Northern Gateway case, or how does this case differ?
Well, I think the basic principles are the same. The deficiencies in the environmental review process and National Energy Board review process, or part of the arguments, as were the arguments brought by First Nations around the inadequacy of consultation by the Crown. So the principles there are the same, and it ultimately was the inadequacy of consultation that killed Northern Gateway. With every case, though, the facts are going to be a little bit different. The approval was different. The consultation approach was different. It was under Justin Trudeau's government rather than Stephen Harper's. So there are differences, but at the same time, the principles remain the same.
So that was one of the main questions you wanted to ask. From a legal perspective, how is the federal government able to bypass the will of provincial and municipal governments and local Indigenous communities?
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of this is grounded in some pretty old constitutional enactments, in particular, a section of the Constitution that places intra-provincial and export infrastructure like the pipeline under the jurisdiction of the federal government. If you look at that actual section, it talks about things like telegraph lines and railway lines, and it was that type of thing that back in the day, the federal government would undertake as these big national projects. You think about the railway, Trans-Canada Railway or the highway or those types of things. I think what's interesting today is that there's a huge shift, right? A lot more of the important and day-to-day interactions with governments and decision-making happens on a much more local level, whether it's cities or provinces. And so I think that's going to be part of the challenge, both legally and politically, for the federal government to try and force through a pipeline without the consent of local communities. I think there's another element here that didn't exist when the Constitution was initially enacted, which is the duty owed to First Nations to make to consult and seek the consent and accommodate where appropriate decisions that affect First Nations rights, and that's particularly relevant here in British Columbia, where most of the province has never been ceded by treaty. So I think all of these add up to quite a lot of legal uncertainty and political challenges, and you add to that kind of the decline of the oil industry, or at least the beginning of the decline of the oil industry, and even economically, it doesn't necessarily make sense.
And can I just ask, just to clarify, so basically you're saying that based on precedent, the federal government can override provincial and municipal policies and decisions if the issue at hand is energy or land that's beneficial to the whole of Canada? Is that kind of what you're saying about?
Yeah, I mean, there's so for certain things, yes, and interprovincial pipelines are included in those certain things. There are Canadian law doctrines that kind of clarify this. The one is called interjurisdictional immunity. And really what it means is that the courts recognize that our lives, our everyday lives, are not so easy to divide up in between different jurisdictions. And so, in fact, the preference of the court is to read local laws, municipal laws, provincial laws, and federal laws in a way that is compatible. Where there is a conflict, however, is when when a local law might stop a federal undertaking or a federal project, and in that case, the courts have been have upheld this idea of interjurisdictional immunity and federal paramountcy as well, so that the federal laws are paramount to the other ones. And I think that's a challenge. It's a challenge for folks, especially in BC, who are bearing the disproportionate amount of risk from this pipeline for the benefit of primarily Alberta.
Right. So could cases like this realistically lead to constitutional change? For example, clearer jurisdiction between land and energy rights, or even City of Victoria or Eco-Justice have talked about the human right to a healthy environment, like being embedded in the Constitution?
Yeah, I mean, I think they will certainly provide some clarity on those questions. In terms of actually changing the Constitution, as you're probably aware, it's a pretty high bar. It requires a big amount of change. But at the same time, our Supreme Court has said very clearly that a Constitution is not a static document. It's a living tree, and it's constantly changing and constantly growing. So I think that's one of the interesting things about this case and this moment, is that it's not just about a pipeline. It touches on these much broader issues, including reconciliation and Indigenous rights, including climate change and climate policy. And of course, it's the cities who are on the forefront of dealing with climate change in terms of infrastructure and so on, yet they have very little power to affect some of the decisions. It also is touching, as we've talked about, on Canadian federalism and the nature of Canadian federalism. So, yes, I think we'll have, the constitutional issues will be addressed in the case. I don't think this is the place where, amendments to the Constitution will happen in a big way, in the way that, as for example, including a right to a healthy environment. But at the same time, I do also think that there are very strong constitutional provisions, in particular in terms of seeking the consent of Indigenous peoples before making decisions that will affect them, and that remains a kind of central part of this case.
Okay, so once again, from a legal perspective, what does 2018 hold for the fight against the Kinder Morgan pipeline?
So we will expect to have the decision from the Federal Court of Appeal, like I said, within likely in the next 6 months. There are also two decisions pending from the BC Supreme Court, where Squamish Nation in one of them and the City of Vancouver in another have challenged the province's approval for the project. And those decisions will also likely come in that same time frame, the next 6 months. Of course, all of those have the potential to be appealed. So for the BC Supreme Court cases, they would be appealed to the BC Court of Appeal. For the Federal Court of Appeal cases, they could be appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada. No guarantee that either of those courts will agree to hear those cases, but it's certainly a possibility. In the meantime, the National Energy Board is continuing its process, and so they will be doing specific route hearings over the next 3 months. They'll be in Burnaby in March, I believe, at the Delta Hotel on near the Willingdon Highway exit, and as well as up in the Fraser Valley and all along the route. And those are about landowners disputing Kinder Morgan's chosen route, especially when it affects them negatively. So those are all things that will be happening legally in the next 6 months, and of course there may be other things that pop up that we don't know about yet.
Totally. Did you have anything else to add before we let you go? And thank you for your time.
No, I'm good.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much for speaking with us.
Hi, everyone. You're listening to CITR 101.9 FM. The show is Democracy Watch. So that was Eugene Kung of West Coast Environmental Law. That interview was conducted by News Collective members Alex DeBoer and Stephanie Wood. And that's it for a segment on growing opposition to Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project. After the break, we'll have our segment about demonstrations held in downtown Vancouver in support of the protests in Iran. I'm Malam Dialanian, and you're listening to Democracy Watch on CITR 101.9 FM.
Second rally in the afternoon, which was at 1 o'clock, and
Is Coco Hamamatsu talking about koi fish in a pond, or the youth at CITR and Discorder? Get info on your wares, services, or events directly to students, musicians, artists, and all the coolest cats from Bellingham to Squamish by advertising with CITR and Discorder, on air, in print, or online. This can be your reality if you email us at advertising@citr.ca or call 604-822-4342. Visit citr.ca for rates and packages.
Hello, welcome back to Democracy Watch on CITR 101.9 FM. I am Rahmatullah Sheikh. And yeah, you're listening to Democracy Watch. We have an extended show today, so it's 6 p.m., but you're still with us. We just heard a coverage on Vancouver's growing resistance to Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. We now turn our attention to a different topic. Members of the Iranian diaspora in Vancouver organized a rally on January the 6th in support of protesters in Iran. Now, just a reminder for our listeners, it's been over 2 weeks since protests broke out in the city of Mashhad in Iran and spread to other parts of the country. Reports claim that at least 21 people have died in violent clashes with security guards and over 1,000 have been arrested. Demonstrators are expressing a range of grievances. Protests started first with a call for controls on rising expenses and unemployment, but some others are demanding a complete dismantling of the existing ruling structure. The demonstrations in Vancouver were equally as complicated. There were two events held on Saturday, January the 6th. The first one began at 11 a.m. and the other one in the afternoon at 1 p.m. Both groups had conflicting takes on how the protests in Iran must be addressed. Flashpoints emerged with topics like whether Western intervention is necessary, should trade sanctions exist, and what the role of the monarchy, which ruled Iran before the 1979 revolution, should be. The differences turned to heated conversations and even violent pushing and shoving outside the Vancouver Art Gallery. Our reporter Jonathan Ventura caught some of that on the tape, and this is what you're listening to in the background. So, why did the rally in Vancouver turn violent? Why is the Iranian community in Vancouver split on key issues? And is there any way they can reconcile these differences? We first spoke to Sara Saghai, an Iranian activist in Vancouver. We also spoke to Muhajir, an Iranian professor at the University of British Columbia. But first, here's Sara Saghai. We asked her to explain why there were two protests on January the 6th.
Second rally in the afternoon, which was at 1 o'clock, and this was organized by individuals in the community, some of whom I'm familiar with. But the problem that I had was that the rally claimed to have no specific political leanings, and it was put on only in support of protests in Iran. But when we showed up, it turned out that most of the people who went to that rally were by and large supporters of the old monarchist regime of Iran, which was toppled after the 79 revolution. And the same group, they had organized another rally on Monday, and the same thing happened. So this time we showed up in protest to that other current, because we're supportive of what's happening in Iran and of people protesting and asking for their demands, but we're definitely against that movement, and we see that as a regressive way of supporting protests in Iran to suggest that the monarchists have any claim to the fate of the Iranian protests.
What exactly happened at the march? So we had one of our reporters, Jonathan Ventura, who was there, and he recorded some of those heated conversations. But if you could give us an idea of what really the whole friction was about at the rally.
We were a group of maybe 10 to 20 people, and we had some signs and a large banner that said, U.S. NATO hands off Iran. You would think that's a fairly simple stance to take, and no one would advocate for the opposite. But it turned out that some people were advocating for the opposite, which is that they think the best way to support or help the protesters in Iran is to call for Western intervention. We think that is a very regressive stance to take. It's very it's obviously not going to help Iranians or their economic or cultural and political situation if you think their protest should be met with Western bombs.
So is that what you were protesting for? That you want the Iranian discourse to take place amongst the people of Iran without Western intervention?
Absolutely, yes. We believe in the self-determination of the people in Iran, and we believe that there are two ways to support the protests in Iran. One is a regressive way and one is a progressive way. And we protested the protest on Saturday because we saw it as the regressive kind of support.
Right.
That is not going to help Iranians in Iran.
It seems that the issue of the sanctions, the Western sanctions or the US-led sanctions on Iran were a point of conflict there too, and that is pretty much what the Vancouver Sun also reported on. Could you tell us how the sanction is basically dividing two factions of people on that protest and in Vancouver?
So there's a lot of propaganda on sanctions and what sanctions are and what they're supposed to do. That comes from Western media. For instance, U.S. administration has been talking about this myth of smart sanctions that are supposed to not affect the people, but the government. And the reality is that sanctions are as inhumane as wars and as bombs, and they always affect the poorest and the most vulnerable sections of the population.
By resisting or by protesting the lifting of sanctions, are they trying to suggest that this could, in a way, then make the case for the existing Iranian regime more stronger? And is this something that they wouldn't want to see? Because if the sanctions are lifted, then it's a political gain for the existing government.
Yeah, that's true. They see it as strengthening the regime. But what they don't see, so this is actually buying into the binary that I just talked about, the binary or the division between the people and the state. The people are good, the state is bad. We have to sanction the state in order to free the people. And I'm saying that is propaganda, and that is completely false. That's not how things happen. If you lift the sanctions, maybe you will strengthen the state, but you strengthen the people as well. And when you strengthen the people, you strengthen the civil society, and you strengthen the dissent, the ability for the people to dissent and to change and to reform from within.
Yeah, so Sarah, I'm wondering then, how do you see Canada's posture towards the protest right now? They seem to have issued a press release so far. It seems that they are in support of the protesters. However, do you want to see more from Canada's government, or do you think even saying something as far as this equates to Western intervention? I'm just curious.
I would not support any strong stance from Canadian politicians. I think a symbolic support for people of Iran is fine. The bottom line is that Iran is usually treated with a lot of exceptionalism and a double standard in the international community. For instance, the U.S. administration called for an emergency UN Security Council meeting last week to discuss Iran protests, and they were rightly humiliated by France and Russia, for instance, because of that, because other countries can see that this is a domestic issue, and U.S. was trying to interfere in the domestic issues of a sovereign state. So all we're saying is that the sovereignty of the country should be respected.
Vancouver has a large population with Iranian ancestry, close to 35,000 according to some reports. And whatever is reported in Vancouver then sort of becomes important, and it becomes important to see it with a fine comb. How do you think the Vancouver media is reporting on the Iranian protests? Do you think are they able to accurately depict what's happening and the complexities of the issue as we both are discussing right now?
So it's difficult to talk about local Vancouver coverage because they usually are more kind of streamlined from mainstream coverage because there isn't a strong connection between the kind of local outlets with say something with an international issue like Iran protests, right? So that becomes an issue in the sense of where do these outlets get their information from? And I think the Iranian community here, unfortunately, is not well represented and is not very active and strong in the public scene, and that results in situations like the rally on Saturday. A lot of the reporters who were there had no idea what was happening. Like some of us try to talk to them and explain to them what the issues were and what the contentions were about. And I think there was some really good coverage. For instance, the Vancouver Sun coverage was really excellent, and they talked about sanctions, which was the core issue there. But some other coverage, for instance, the CTV coverage, I was really disappointed that they didn't try to explain why people were arguing. They just, it seemed like, I don't want to say intentionally, but maybe there was just this portrayal of this entire community as violent and as, we just, as if like we can't resolve our disagreements.
Yeah, did you fear this? Did you fear this happening as the violence, or let's say as the skirmish or whatever was unfolding in front of you? Did you have this fear at the back of your mind that, oh God, this is going to be represented in a very different way and maybe some people will lose the point?
Of course. I mean, we were very familiar with the racist and Islamophobic discourse on Iran in general. So I see even the mainstream coverage on the Iran protests having those elements because for instance, the Iranian people are constantly almost infantilized. They're seen as incapable of making changes for their own lives, and they need the Western governments to come in and intervene and talk about what's happening in Iran or take strong positions against the government to help the population. But yeah, so it's an extension of the same kind of racist and Islamophobic discourse. I saw that as playing out in some of the local coverage. And of course, when you're otherized, when you're a population that we're speaking Farsi, we're having our own kind of really intricate internal political fights, and there's almost no bridge, no translation happening between the context, which is Vancouver, and the Canadian politics. So all of those fights, they're kind of they're always concealed from the eyes of the Canadian or Western public, and that's because, and that's the result of the same issue that I'm criticizing, which is that Iran is always portrayed as black and white. There's just the government that's bad and the people that are good. And the nuances are never seen. It's never reflected in the media that the civil society in Iran, they want reforms. They don't want Western intervention. Most people don't, right?
Yeah.
So these things, because it's not reflected, because these stories are not told in the mainstream, we see it as kind of unable to be spoken in the local media as well.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Sarah, if what happened on the afternoon of 6th of January in downtown, if that skirmish and that tension is emblematic of what's happening in Iran, or is that only unique to what happened in Vancouver?
It's definitely not special to Vancouver, and other protests around the world where Iranians around the world have staged similar rallies in support of Iran protests. There has been similar tensions and similar even breakout of violence, unfortunately. That is definitely representative of the two currents that I just talked about. There's the regressive current and the progressive current, as I'm calling them. But I wouldn't go as far as saying this is representative of exactly what's happening in Iran, because most of the movements I'm calling them the regressive movements, pro-monarchy, the pro-intervention. Most of these come from the diaspora, and they're injected into the Iranian society. And the ideas and the positions and the narratives are injected into the Iranian society through the media, the very strong media presence that these groups have outside Iran, and the strong following that they find in Iran.
The two groups that seem to be divided on the square on the 6th of Jan, is there any middle ground where the two of you can coexist and then have a message that unites both the groups, or is this division going to be permanent, irrespective of what happens with the protests in Iran?
I think there's a middle ground. I think a lot of people were in that middle ground on Saturday, people who were present at the rally. I think the biggest issue for most people was the fact that we were not allowed to speak. We were invited as speakers to the second rally, but we had the mic snatched from us, and our turn was taken by others. And on top of that, it was the violence that we saw. So the biggest issue for the community, I think, right now, and I'm talking to people all the time about this, is the issue of tolerance and the issue of allowing a diverse set of opinions to be represented, even if they're directly against what you stand for. Maybe you think they are opposite your stance. Maybe they aren't really. So on Saturday, for instance, they totally assumed that we were pro-government, pro-Islamic Republic. That's because they never listened to us. They never allowed us to explain why we think lifting sanctions is important. Is important for supporting Iranian protesters or the people of Iran and their struggle against government policies.
Hello, welcome back. You're listening to Democracy Watch on CITR 101.9 FM. It's 6:20, and that was Sara Sagay, an Iranian activist in Vancouver who participated in one of the protests in Vancouver. Now, up next, we have another interview. We spoke to Mohajir. A little note here. We have been requested to use a pseudonym to protect her identity. Mohajir is an Iranian professor at the University of British Columbia. This interview is important. It gives us an understanding of the complexities of the issue. And understanding this is key to knowing what the protests are all about, both in Iran and in Vancouver. So here's an interview with Mohajir. See you. Okay. So just to give you a background, we are covering the Iranian protests that took place in Vancouver and obviously tying it to the protests that are taking place in Iran. So you were present during the Green Movement during the 2009 protests in Iran. Now there are some people who are trying to draw comparisons or differences between what's happening now and what happened during the protests there. Do you see any comparisons, or what are the point of differences that you see between these two protests?
So one of the main, I think, differences between the protests in 2017-18 and the 2009 ones is that the protests in 2009 mostly started from Tehran and mostly were students and the more kind of, I don't want to say elite, but I want to say the more kind of issues that were raised were based on human rights and freedom of speech. But in this movement, first of all, it started from other major cities, but not Tehran, which means Mashhad started it. And then it kind of went into smaller and smaller cities, and then it got into Tehran. And the main issue was economy. So for the 2009, the main issue was the election, of course, and that many people didn't want Mr. Ahmadinejad to be the president, and they were contesting the results of the election. But for this one, it was mostly because of economic issues. In terms of differences, it started with an anti-Rouhani kind of theme. But then it kind of escalated into the point that it took the government in general and the whole Iranian leadership. I don't want to use the word regime, but the whole Iranian leadership into question. But in 2009, it wasn't so much, it didn't start from there. It actually started from, we don't want this guy, we want another guy, but then it escalated again into taking the regime into question, so the Iranian leadership into question.
Yeah. So we saw that at the protests on Saturday, there was some points of conflict, and there was like some sort of violent behavior, and it seems like this issue is really complex.
Yes.
And the Iranian diaspora, or people with Iranian ancestry, number in about 35,000 according to some estimates. So do you think that the diaspora can come to a certain middle ground and to some conclusion and come on a common plane regarding this?
Well, I don't know how to predict that, because I think that the issue that you saw happen here on Saturday is a very historical conflict that the Iranian people have with one another, and that happened since the revolution of 1979. When the revolution of 1979 happened, a lot of people fled Iran because of their ties to the monarchy, or they feared, a religious regime coming on. And if for whatever reason, there are a lot of people who fled the country due to that change in the political structure. But there are a lot of people who also grew up during the revolution and then decided to leave either in 2009, which was one peak, or later on as, it became available for Iranians to gain PR in Canada and then gain citizenship. So there was a huge influx in them leaving. Now, in Iran, there are a lot of political camps that people have different ideas. Two major ones that have been kind of conflicting with each other since the early years after the revolution and during the Iran-Iraq war. One camp says that we need a total and complete regime change, which means basically another revolution, and then we change the leaders and we have the secular government that is very democratic, and basically their option for leadership has always been the former Shah's son, Reza Pahlavi, who's kind of become by his own claim, the de facto leader of this movement, which, again, it's his own claim. But there's another camp that are basically mostly, and I haven't done any studies on this, but based on my conversations and my own reporting on this, it's been mostly people who grew up in Iran and then left later on. And for some Iranians, regime change and another revolution is not something that they're looking for. Reform, which you've heard it a lot, the reformist party of Rouhani, is basically what they are trying to get at, because for many, the 1979 revolution happened for a reason. So a lot of people may want to paint the former Shah as a more moderate leader. He was much more Western than the current leadership. but he wasn't without fault. And there was a reason behind the massive protests and the demands that he leaves power. One of them being not, the same issues we still have, not adhering to human rights, not respecting critical voices, actually applying heavy consequences for anyone who speaks against him. So it's become a very confusing situation for those who are watching it from the outside, because it's not like everyone wants the same thing, and that's a very important issue to point out. For those who think that Mr. Pahlavi could come and become the next leader of Iran, they are missing a lot of points within the Iranian public. The issue of sanctions that you asked me, for those who are in favor of total and complete regime change in Iran, they think the more pressure the Iranian people are under, such as sanctions, the better it will get for the chances of a regime change. Why? Because then they'll pressure the government into issues, and then massive protests will break down, the country will go into chaos, and then boom, we have another revolution on our hands. But the issue here is that they are talking about this mostly from the comfort of the West, right? They have their citizenships, they have their PRs, they have whatever they need to survive here. They're in a country that allows free speech. They're in a country that, well, if they're staying here, basically they can afford it. And most of their families have also left. Now, there are a lot of with families there, but when you go into the structures of these people who are asking for more chaotic events in Iran so that it could kind of contribute to regime change, it's mostly people who won't lose much if these things happen. But there's another camp that have left Iran but still have businesses back home or have family there, or they are really basically against the idea of a big, full-fledged revolution, and all they want is just some improvement in how Iran is being governed, because it's a very rich country. It has a lot of rich resources of human power because the population is very young. It's a very more moderate country in terms of religion within the people themselves. Forget about how, Iran is presented through the Western, coverage. And it's a country that was going towards progress. And so what the people are asking for basically is that we change what the camp that is in favor of reform, that we change main issues in Iran. For example, we change the way we choose our, supreme leader, or some even ask, do we even need a supreme leader? But even those who want to keep the supreme leader, they want more accountability. They want a government like the Rouhani. And even if they don't get into that kind of political, nitty-gritty stuff, they want a president, a government that will be more transparent with them, make it easier to live, more access to information, cheaper expenses for a normal, young couple or young person, and things like that, because it's very hard to kind of say this is what the Iranian people want right now. I would be very wary of anyone who claims they know exactly what the Iranian people want, because it's hard to know that. And there's a lot of layers within the Iranian society that you need, you have to be very honest here and accept that the Iranian government, as it is right now, as you saw in the recent elections, there was, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 75% participation. That's not a low participation rate for a country that many argue that people are not interested in its government anymore. That's not true. Elections have shown us that people come out. Now, whether we want to think that these elections and the numbers are rigged or not, that's fine, but basically they're not, because we see over the past during the past Iranian presidential elections, I remember the kind of social media fervor there was between people that go out and vote. You know, don't give up. You need to vote for the reformists. This is what's going to happen. So that is basically what most of this is coming from.
So one of the places where we try and understand this really complicated matter is media. And you're someone who studies media as a profession. How do you see Western media and Canadian media in specific? How have they covered the Iranian protests, and how would you rate that?
Well, I don't know how I would rate that now. I'm in the process of gathering information and writing a research paper on this. But in general, some networks, such as Fox News, for example, have tried to simplify the issues that the Iranians are dealing with. Even you could see these in the speeches given, or the tweets the tweets given out by President Trump. But the reality is, it's not that simple. There are rumors in Iran that the protests actually started by the hardliners to undermine the Rouhani government. And then it got out of hand. So you have to keep this in mind. And I think this is something that Western media are starting to become much more cognizant of, is that because there is limited information that is that you could verify as a journalist, and it's mostly hearsay. In Iran, the accountability of rumor is much higher than the news you get from the state media. The reason for this is obvious, right? It's because people don't trust the state media. Again, I haven't done a study to tell you what percentage doesn't trust, but in general, from what I hear from my friends or my family or other people, is that the Iranian media is often really hard to rely on for day-by-day information. On the other hand, the Iranians have the sources of news from BBC Farsi and VOA Farsi. One is from Britain, one is from the US. Both countries with significant problematic history with Iran. America has burned Iran and Iranians many times. The British have burned Iran and Iranians many times. And having two networks from there, still when people listen, they're like, okay, this is even though they're really amazing Iranian journalists in BBC Farsi. I have my comments about VOA, which I won't get into, but BBC Farsi has ex-Iranian journalists, which has made people trust the network more. But in terms of the New York Times, look, in Iran, these networks are trusted, of course, but I'm not saying they don't know what's going on in Iran. We have amazing reporting by people like Thomas Erbnik, who are in Iran, or we had amazing reporting by people like Jason Rezaian, who was unfortunately jailed and had to leave Iran. But the fact of the matter is that Iran's politics right now are very complicated. And what I don't see that much in some media coverage is framing that complication, that this is not an easy issue to analyze. And it's a dangerous thing to predict because there's no prediction here, you know? So I wish I had a straightforward answer for you, but in general, I think by relying on accounts from people and analysts and real life happenings there as they are reported, I think the reporting is pretty well rounded. What I don't think is appropriate is giving too much emphasis on people, for example, like Reza Pahlavi, as the talking head of all this, because for many Iranians, this he has been absent for the last 30 years. Iran has gone through major catastrophes like earthquakes. The travel ban happened. There was no, there was no statement from him, as far as I know. Maybe you can find something. There were major earthquakes. the Pahlavi dynasty was never an active part in the Iranian people's lives. So for networks to rely on him as the talking head for this movement is a little bit problematic for someone like me who grew up after the revolution and basically never heard of him. And I only heard like stories about the days, like the day he was born and how my parents got this school day off. You know, that's basically what I knew of him, because he was never present in our lives. He never took any action to show that, okay, unless there was, you know, something like this and he would suddenly become this talking head of freedom and, you know. So that is the problematic part for me of choosing people that they talk to. And hasn't been really in touch with the people there either. So, you know, maybe in 2 weeks' time I will have a better answer for you. But for now, because I mostly read, you know, the New York Times, Washington Post and that, it seems pretty well-rounded. But we'll have to see how it goes, you know.
Yeah. The other interesting thing has been Canada's stance on the Iranian protest. So they sent out a press release saying that they support the protesters and the demands of the people, a very generic press release that you would expect from them. Are you satisfied with this, or do you think that anything more than this could equate to foreign intervention, which again is a very sensitive topic amongst Iranians? So how do you see that?
I don't, in general, I don't think that... I think that this is for the Canadian people to decide whether they're satisfied with how their government reacted. For me as an Iranian, which I am, you know, I'm not a dual citizen yet, I personally think the less Western leaders jump to conclusions about any kind of movement in the Middle East, the better. I don't see why we always need a statement to kind of, you know, excite us about. The Iranian people are doing what the Iranian people need to do, regardless of whether Mr. Trudeau or Mr. Trump or whoever wants to support them or not. That has never been a factor. And the fact that people think that if, you know, America is much more forceful, the Iranians will get... No, as I said, there's a pretty big mistrust issue between Iran and the West. And by Iran, I mean the Iranian people. So, I mean, it's great if any government supports the people of any country. But, you know, Canada could do a lot more than making statements. You know, I just got back from a reporting trip in Turkey.
Hello, you're still with us. You're listening to Democracy Watch on CITR 101.9 FM. We're going into a short break and we'll be back very soon. Stay tuned.
I think the news midweek, when the midweek news broke that Teo Desar wasn't going to be playing in this game.
Growing sport, and to do it on a university campus with an educational message behind it.
They'll be facing off against all the big teams from all the other conferences and the nationals.
Want to be a CITR sports broadcaster? Looking for a cool way to get involved in UBC sports? Then email sports101@citr.ca or come by our station in the Nest to find out more. See you soon.
Hello, you're listening to Democracy Watch on CITR 101.9 FM. You're listening to our interview with Mohajer on the Iranian protest that took place in downtown Vancouver. Here's the continuation.
Way of helping Iranians, then yes, of course, it would be great if any leader supports public uprisings that are legitimate. But for me as an Iranian, that's like number 10 on my list, you know? Right. What is more important to me is actually... facilitating life for people. Whether, I mean, if Mr. Rouhani comes out tomorrow and brings out 5 reforms that will really make life easier, all the power to him. I support him 100%. I don't really, what bothers me is the hypocrisy, for example, from the Trump administration, which a few months ago we were terrorists that needed to be banned from the country, and now we're a cultured society, which, you know, he's going to help us out of it. Yeah, it doesn't work like that. Yeah. And thankfully, a lot of Iranians, there was this really interesting telegram message that went around that had 4 pictures. One was Trump, one was Maryam Rajavi, the MEK leader, one was the Saudi prince, the king, and the other one, I think it was Benjamin Netanyahu, who had also support. But again, if about a year ago he had called us an untrustworthy nation in his account to the Congress, and people had written down by it was these 4 pictures, and people have written, under any circumstances, the 4 of you please shut up. That's how the people feel, because it's hypocrisy to its to its core. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, it's not enough to just say we support the people of Iran. I think the Obama administration showed that by facilitating visas for Iranian students, allowing multiple entry visas for us to go and see our families. So I really don't understand this whole statement issue thing, because I think even for the people, it's really not on the top of their list. Mm-hmm. And it's on the government of Canada, and it's conscious what it wants to do about, public uprisings anywhere in the world. Yeah. So maybe this is a question you need to ask them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So are you in touch with anyone in Iran right now who is affected by these protests? Because I'm wondering, there is the mainstream media, which may not get all the elements right. Mm-hmm. There is social media, which is curtailed, if not banned, in Iran. Mm-hmm. So how are you getting in touch with your family and friends?
My family and friends are mostly really, my friends are mostly my college friends who are now 30-something-year-old fathers and mothers who need to get to work. So protesting is not really on top of their list either. They either have kids or sick parents or, their own lives. We all have Telegram groups that were in touch with each other. For a few days that was banned, and it was very hard, and people felt pretty much insulted by the fact that one day they have access to information, the other day they don't, while our leader, like Mr. Rouhani, gets out and tweets while Twitter is banned. It's like the Republic of Irony. But it's for other people, we get in touch pretty easily, but some have to use VPNs, some have to, the video quality is not good when you want to see your father after, a week, and you just want to say hi, but you can't really make out his face. It bothers you, it bothers you because this stuff is so irrelevant in the Western world, right? We take it for so much granted. And they are getting by. Things are hard. I mean, it's not easy when you read that a lot of people have been arrested. You wonder what about their families, but personally, I don't know anyone directly, but I'm reading a lot of stories and a lot of issues that people are heavily affected by it, the protests and what happened. So it's pretty intense. And you always worry about interference, right? You don't want anyone to decide anything for you other than yourself. I mean, no matter what Iran is, it's home, and it's our home, and we get to decide what happens in it. And I think for those people, because you talked about intervention, I don't remember a lot in our history that, a foreigner acting as a savior has ever worked for us. So I just think that I'm not a very nationalistic person either. I find a lot of faults within, the country, and anyone who loves their country should. Being critical of a country doesn't mean that you don't love it. But one thing I know about my people, and one thing I know about my country is that, and my history is that, we're always much better off when we decide our fate, and not someone else. I guess that's the biggest issue now, that even if, many say, why doesn't America just go and, help Iranians out? Yeah, but do we really want that, Mm-hmm. And frankly, within the past few years, the U.S. and a lot of Western countries have lost their supportive status in the Middle East because of all the mess there. So, I think that's the biggest issue.
That was Mohajer, a professor at the University of British Columbia. Remember, that's her pseudonym. Leaving us with a word of caution. But we're going to leave you on a word of promise, and that's to come back again next week on Thursday at 5 p.m. You were listening to Democracy Watch on CITR 101.9 FM.